I'm talking today with the Reverend Dr. Peter Adam, for many years a Vicar of St Jude's and subsequently Principal of Ridley, Melbourne. Peter is a theologian. These days he travels the country and the world teaching and preaching the Bible. We are grateful that he's willing to share a personal story about the depression he has suffered for much of his life. Peter, you've told us that you suffer from depression. How did it happen?
Oh, friend, I've written down my answers because I find it very stressful talking about it, and because I wanted to prepare useful answers for other people as well. So please excuse me if I read my answers to your questions. It was Easter '85. I'd been at St Jude's for 3 years, and Easter was, of course, a busy time of ministry. Easter Monday I just started crying and couldn't stop, and over the next months I fell into a deep depression. It took me about 3 years to begin feeling normal again, the new normal, and I'm still on medication 30 years later and still see my psychiatrist regularly, so it's an ongoing issue.
What did it feel like?
Well, firstly it was deep isolation. I felt thoroughly cut off from other people and cut off from God. I felt as if I was in a diving bell, unable to kind of contact the outside world, or alone in an isolation ward with a very thick glass window. So people could wave at me and I could wave at them, but there was no contact between us at all. So that was terrifying. Secondly, really deep guilt. I felt deeply guilty, and I couldn't think what I'd done that was wrong. So it was as if I'd gone down Lygon Street with an axe and hacked somebody to pieces and forgotten what I'd done, but came back with the appropriate guilt, having no idea, but I couldn't think what I'd actually done, which was so bad. And at the end of every conversation, I remember, I'd always ask the person I was talking to, have I said something wrong? Because I had this sense I must have done something wrong in this conversation. So, it was false guilt. We hear about false news. This was false guilt because it was about things I hadn't done. Thirdly, I wanted to die. It seemed the best solution to the pain, and also a big thing for me, if I died, I'd no longer be a nuisance to other people who were trying to care for me. So I stopped wanting to eat, and because every mouthful extended my life. Fourthly, I had a black cloud covering me. It hovered over me all the time, all night, all day, especially when I woke up early. So it was all sudden and overwhelming and paralysing. And I realised afterwards that, of course, our culture focuses so much on how we feel. People always ask you how you feel about things. And we even make an idol of our feelings, I think. And with mental illness, your process and capacity of feeling are radically distorted, so you are in deep trouble. A friend of mine put it, the very tool we try to use to understand and cope with our illness is malfunctioning. However, I also should say that I realise other people suffer more severe mental illness than mine. I didn't have to be hospitalised, and I was able to continue with some ministry at least.
So how did that affect you as a Christian?
Well, of course, very deeply. I found it so hard to trust God, hard to pray, hard to read the Bible. I couldn't trust my emotions, I couldn't trust what I felt. And my sense of sin was so distorted by this false guilt that I had no idea when I was doing real bad things or not. The only faith I had was a faith of the head, not the heart. Deep down I knew, because I'd read it in the Bible, that God could be trusted, and that however I felt, God was true. So I depended entirely on objective truth and objective duty, and without them I would have sunk. In the longer term, it gave me a deeper trust in the Bible, because my feelings of isolation, guilt and wanting to die were insanity. The Bible was actually sanity. So I found there what was true about God, true about the Lord Jesus, true about God's people, and so true about myself. It made me more thankful for God's truth and also more wary of Satan's lies and deceptions. It also made me more thankful for the power of Jesus' blood over Satan and the promise that when Jesus returns, he will change our lowly bodies to be like his glorious body. And I learned to put on more trust in life after the resurrection and so less dependent on this life, which is a great lesson to learn, actually.
Yeah. So how did people respond?
Well, it was amazing. I'd been brought up to think that mental illness was absolutely unmentionable, a sign of dramatic failure, a cause of deep embarrassment, and the worst thing that could ever happen to you. Having to go to a psychiatrist was the most difficult thing I've ever done, and I'd been brought up to think I must not be a nuisance to anyone, so I was in real trouble. But it was such a great shock to find that good friends and St Jude's in general didn't shun me. On the contrary, I was surrounded by love and support from everyone. I couldn't believe it. And it continued in the long term, and I thought people would get sick of having someone depressed around, but they didn't. I recognised that they were frustrated because it was hard to know how to relate to me, and nothing people said or did made any difference. But they kept on doing what they should, and for that I'm deeply grateful. No Christian told me I should just pull myself together, though non-Christians did. And no Christian avoided me, which is remarkable, and for that I'm really thankful to God.
What helped?
Well, persistent and patient care from people who loved me, thoughtfulness. Simple acts were invaluable, so being taken for a walk, someone providing a meal, someone taking me to the botanic gardens, people calling in, people praying for me, and the occasional hug. They must have felt they weren't making a difference, but they were. One wise friend encouraged me to do one thing a day which I enjoyed. Well, I didn't enjoy it very much, but it was still worth doing. And of course, I deeply valued people's prayers. I felt paralysed in my praying, but knowing that others were trusting God and praying for me privately and publicly in church was a great encouragement. Even if God wouldn't hear my prayers, he might hear other people's prayers. And people told me that God would care for me, and that helped me believe it. I now think that trying to help someone with depression is in some ways more difficult than having depression. For it's so hard to know how to help, and often helping doesn't seem to help at all. When I talked about my guilt, people would remind me of Jesus' death on the cross for my sin. This didn't actually help with false guilt, because it seemed as if they were accepting the reality of my false guilt, so that was difficult to deal with. So I had to remind myself that when the Holy Spirit convicts us of sin, it's always of specific actions or thoughts in the real world, and that Satan wants us to feel general guilt and unworthiness. So learning to reject false guilt was essential for my sanity. There were two psalms, of course, which I found helpful. The first was Psalm 88, which I was delighted to discover was unmitigated gloom from beginning to end with no happy ending, and ends with darkness is my closest friend. So that meant someone else had had these feelings too, and their experience was recorded in the Bible. So I was not alone, and God recognised that people felt like that sometimes. So my depression was authenticated by that psalm. That was wonderful. I used to say the psalm again and again. And the second was Psalm 139, which includes the words, "You created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. Your eyes saw my body, unformed body, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." So it was actually God's creation of me which was so helpful. God created me, intended me. I was not a mistake or an unwanted nuisance to God. And because God had created me, he understood me more deeply than I understood myself. That was the great help. I couldn't understand myself. Other people couldn't understand me, but God could. And on better days, I was able to enjoy the simple pleasures of creation, sunshine, clouds and rain, plants and animals, and having a deeply sympathetic and patable dog was a great help, I might say. But depression lessens energy, and depression distorts perceptions of reality. I now suffer from tinnitus, an illness of hearing. I don't hear as well as I used to. Loud noise hurts, and I mishear what people say. So both depression and tinnitus diminish my connection with external reality. But I have to accept these disadvantages and learn to live with them. Looking for ways to serve others helped, as did repenting of wanting to die and praying instead for a long life and ministry, which prayer God seems to be answering very generously. But by the way, I noticed that the first major illness people experience in their lifetime is often a great shock, because you think your body will last forever and all of a sudden it lets you down in whatever way. I often see people get very upset.
So looking back on having depression, what do you think it was? What do you think about what happened?
Well, to be honest, I think I was always a melancholy person, and eventually it came to the surface. I was certainly working too hard at the time, so part of it I think was burnout. Perhaps the burnout triggered the emergence of the depression. I think there's a tendency to depression in my family, and there were difficult features in my childhood which had an effect as well. But the fact I've been on antidepressants for over 30 years indicates it's partly a long-term medical condition, I think, though I'm not a medical expert. The pills don't remove the depression, but they lighten it and make it manageable. But overall, on looking back, I think of my depression as a good thing and a gift of God. For it brought underlying problems to the surface when I had to deal with them. For example, I'd always thought throughout my ministry that I should serve God, but that God could never actually use me. So when people told me that God had used a sermon I preached, I would think, well, I'm so glad that God had been kind to you, but he certainly didn't use me to do it. The depression intensified that feeling and brought it to the surface and made me deal with it, which was a good thing. It removed my absolute independence and taught me to ask for help and not feel that I was a nuisance in doing so. I'm still learning to ask for help, but it began the process. I learnt the precious lesson that God can use us in our weakness. When I was unwilling to eat because I didn't want to stay alive, I made the decision to start eating again as a way of thanking God for the birth of a child to friends of mine who'd been praying for one for a long time. This was good progress because it meant I was looking outside myself for causes of thanksgiving. I hope it made me more sympathetic in my personal interactions and more sympathetic in my public ministry and preaching. So about 5 years after my depression began, someone said to me after he heard me give a Bible study, "I don't know what's happened to you, but it certainly made a marvellous difference," which was very kind of him and kind of God. But also after my breakdown, I've only been able to work 50 hours a week. And this limitation means that I had to choose what was most worthwhile to do, say no to other opportunities, and make the most of every moment of those 50 hours. So that actually increased my effective output in ministry, I think. It was also good that I decided to talk about my mental illness openly at the time. That was good for me, I think, but it's a good thing to do for others. I've talked about it on many occasions. Many people have thanked me for doing it because they suffer from mental illness or they're caring for others who suffer. So breaking the cone of silence is well worth doing, and that's one reason I was happy to do this interview with you, of course. However, I keep on saying just because I'm depressed doesn't mean I automatically understand other people who are depressed. Depression is expressed in different ways in different people. Having depression doesn't mean I understand other forms of mental illness, and I'm not a doctor.
So what do you think causes mental illness?
Goodness, what a question. I think I mentioned what I thought were contributing factors in my case, but I'm not sure. It's easy to see the symptoms, but it's not always easy to see what the root cause is, if there is indeed just one cause. And of course, I can't generalise from my case to every case, nor from depression to other forms of mental illness. In one sense, I think mental illness is like other illness. If you have a genetic tendency to an illness, that may be the reason. You may have experienced some trauma. You may suffer the consequences of bad lifestyle. You may have developed some destructive habits. You may have tried illicit drugs. I take it that any of these, or all of these, can contribute to an illness and to mental illness. So from one perspective, mental illness is like having a weak heart or a physical disability. Though, of course, illness which has a obvious physical cause is easier to understand. I understand that doctors are still working out what causes some form of mental illness, as they are still working out what treatments work and why they work. I think people often want there to be one cause, but human existence is usually more multifactorial. So I guess that's so with illness of the human body. If health is multifactorial, then illness is likely to be as well, though that's not a medical opinion. It's good to admit, I think, that we don't actually know what's happening, and we have to do the best we can with the knowledge we have. I heard one psychiatrist say, "We don't know why this drug works, but it seems to do so, so we use it." So scientists and doctors are not omniscient or omnipotent, and that's a reality of human existence which we all have to accept.
So why do you think God allows mental illness?
Well, there are many answers to that question, because humans are wonderfully complicated creatures, and because what we do has a big effect on ourselves and on others. We can think of the bigger question of why does God allow suffering, because mental illness is just one form of human suffering. And there are many possible reasons why we suffer, and it's important we don't universalise one of them to every example of suffering. So, for example, in John 5, Jesus tells the paralysed man he's healed not to sin again, implying that his paralysis was a result of his sin. But in John 9, the disciples asked about the man born blind if it was his parents' sin or his own sin. Jesus replied, "Neither." So we mustn't universalise one Bible verse, otherwise we'll misread the scriptures. Here are some reasons for mental illness. If someone has been sexually abused as a child or as a teenager, that's likely to result in some form of illness. That, of course, is the fault of the abuser. God has created a world in which we can do good to others, but also God gives us the freedom to harm others in many different ways. Or again, humankind is subject to various forms of illness as part of the futility imposed on us as a result of the fall. We all suffer the consequences of that first sin. This includes the frustrations of life and work, the fact that our best endeavours do not last, the fact that the wicked often flourish, the presence of injustice in human society, and the damage we do to creation, the illnesses we suffer, the tragedies that happen, and the certainty of death. Jesus refers to some of these in Luke 13. They're not specific judgment on anyone, but part of the general degradation of humanity in the world brought about by the presence of sin. And of course, some physical illness can lead to mental illness, as can old age. But again, if I don't care for my body by not eating well, or not getting exercise, or not joining in human community, or by taking illicit drugs, then I will make myself liable to mental illness. God gives us the freedom to live well. God gives us the responsibility to care for ourselves according to the knowledge and information that's available to us. The way we've been treated by parents, by other children or other influential people may lead to some level of stress and mental illness. But this might not be because they intended harm. So one of the saddest features of human life is that even when we intend to do good, we may do harm. And this is the cost of not being all-wise and all-powerful. But in my own case, I think God used it for good. He taught me my weakness. He trained me to ask for help. He showed me that he could use me in my weakness. He enabled me to help others. He reminded me to look forward to my resurrection body, and he taught me long-term and enduring faith.
So what should we do if we think we have symptoms of mental illness?
Well, it's a bit like going to the dentist or going to the doctor. I always put it off as long as possible, but the general rule is the sooner the better. Putting it off might make it worse, and the longer you put it off, the worse it gets. So, make an appointment with your GP this week. Mental illness is just like piles, hemorrhoids, embarrassing but better dealt with. And if you go to your GP and learn you don't have mental illness, that'll make you feel better immediately. So I've learnt to praise God for the skills of my psychiatrist and praise God for the skills which produce my daily medication. Both are wonderful gifts of God.
And how do you think we can best help someone who is suffering from a mental illness?
Love them and pray for them. Encourage them to pray and trust God. I often say to people, the one thing you can do is trust God, and if you can't do it for yourself, I'll do it for you. Next, assure them there's no shame in having mental illness, in admitting to mental illness, in asking for help, in getting medical treatment, and in taking medicine if needed. Some people need to be encouraged to know that our medical and scientific ability is a gift of God. They should make good use of it. It's also good to ask people what they find helpful at a particular time, and what they find helpful this month may not be helpful next month. Help them to get to a doctor or a psychologist or a psychiatrist who will treat the disease, not just the symptoms. I think beware of drugs without therapy. And while encouraging them to trust God, encourage them to get medical help. If you have toothache, by all means pray, but also go to a dentist. It's my advice.
So, Peter, how can we as a church respond to people with mental illness and support people caring for others with mental illness?
Well, I think talking about it openly is the first key. Talking about any suffering openly. No one gets through life unscarred. It's silly to pretend otherwise. Mental illness is a part of human life. There's no reason to feel embarrassment about it. So we often ask people, how are you going? And the polite reply, everything's fine. But it isn't always the honest reply. Next, don't make a fuss in welcoming people such as us, people with mental illness. If you make too much fuss, it assumes that you belong and we don't. And we actually don't like to be embarrassed and featured and got to have people's attention drawn to us. So. And allow us to join as much as we're able. Please don't insist we stay for extended social times after the service. For many of us, that is awful. We just want to escape. Please let us escape. Invite us to join a home group. But I think more at a deeper level, we should ensure that our relationships and friendships in the church function at a deeper level because we are Christians. And Christians are set free, I think, to be open about our struggles. We should pray together when we meet. We should challenge and encourage each other. We should talk at a deeper level than the latest TV show. We should be praying about the deep issues in each other's lives. We should be a church, not just a club. And I think many churches run the danger of being a club where people relate at a friendly human level with their friends, but are not actually relating as Christian believers at any deep level. So I worry that often friendship trumps fellowship. And that's bad because we're friends with people we like, and because friendship is more superficial than true Christian fellowship. So, should we be talking about mental illness? Yes, as we should about pornography, as appropriate, infertility when appropriate, deep sadnesses, being sacked from work, children who aren't Christians, whatever it is, we should be talking about it, encouraging each other and praying for each other. So I love Paul's words in Galatians, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ.
Thank you, Peter. Have you got any other comments that you want to make?
Well, after all that, I'd love you to pray for me.
Which would be my delight. Psalm 91 verse 4 says, God will cover you with his wings. His faithfulness will be your shield and defence. And Lord, I want to pray that for Peter. I pray too that he, Peter, will be so assured of God's deep love for you that he will be less concerned about his usefulness and very concerned about how much you love him. And we thank you for the fact that he has ministered to us over many years, and we thank you too for all the good things you have done for us through him, and we thank you for his openness about his mental illness. God of grace, power and mercy, look on your servant Peter with compassion. Give him courage and complete confidence in your protection, and keep him in peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.